By rights, I should be dead. Every soul on that piece of land should be dead, buried under the same dry dirt we spent our whole lives fighting. We weren't. And the reason we weren't has nothing to do with luck or with God, though I've thanked him for it plenty. The reason is a thing my uncle did one cold gray morning, a thing that every grown man within 40 miles told him was the dumbest, most dangerous mistake a person could make out there. I was 12 years old. I remember it like I remember my own name. Let me tell you where we were first so you can picture it. This was West Texas, the spring of 1871, out past where the maps got lazy and just left things blank. We had a little homestead, my uncle Asa Reardon, his wife Cora, their two small girls, and me. My folks were gone by then. Fever took my mother, and my father, well, my father took himself off west one day and never came back. So Asa raised me like his own and never once made me feel like a burden, which is more than a lot of men would have done. The land out there was beautiful and it was cruel both at the same time. You'd wake up and the whole sky would be one color, this pale washed-out blue, and the grass would be silver with frost, and you'd think there was no prettier place in all creation. Then by noon the wind would come up out of the south and it'd dry your lips till they cracked and bled, and the dust would get in your teeth, and you'd remember the country didn't care a thing about you. We'd had 2 dry years running. The creek that ran along the bottom of our land was down to a thin little trickle most days, just enough to keep the stock alive if you were careful. And we were afraid. I'll be honest about that, because anybody who tells you they lived out there in those years and weren't afraid is lying to you. We were on the edge of the Comanche. That was Comanche country, the real, true heart of it, and they were the most powerful people on those plains by a long mile. There's people today who talk about Indians like they were poor helpless things being pushed around, and maybe later that became true, but in 1871, out where we were, the Comanche were the law and the army and the storm all at once. When they came, you didn't see them till they were on you. Men who'd fought in the war, real soldiers, they were scared of Comanche. So we kept to ourselves. We kept a rifle by the door and another by the bed, and Asa taught me to shoot before he taught me much of anything else. And when somebody'd ride through with news of a raid, a family burned out down on the Salt Fork, horses run off from a place near the breaks, Cora would go quiet for a few days and hold the girls a little closer, and Asa would walk the fence line at dusk with his rifle and not say much. That's the world we were in. I want you to feel how tight it was, how everybody's nerves were strung up like fence wire, before I tell you what happened. Because what happened only makes sense if you understand that. It started with a storm. We got these spring storms that came up out of nowhere. The sky'd be clear, then you'd see a wall of black climbing up in the west, and you had maybe 20 minutes to get the stock in and yourself under a roof before it hit. This one came in the evening late, and it was a bad one. Hail the size of hen's eggs, wind that pulled shingles off the lean-to, and rain, Lord, the rain. That dry creek that'd been a trickle for 2 years, it filled up in an hour and came roaring down the bottom land like something alive, brown and full of brush and busted trees. We rode it out in the cabin. Cora prayed, the girls cried, and Asa stood at the little window watching the lightning crawl across the plains. By morning it had blown itself out and left the world washed clean and steaming, the sun coming up red over a land that smelled like wet earth and broken cedar. Asa and I went out to see what we'd lost. That was the routine after a storm. You went and counted the damage. We found a calf drowned down by the crossing, and a stretch of fence flattened, and we were walking the creek bank looking for the rest of the stock when Asa stopped dead. He didn't say anything. He just held up his hand for me to stop, the way he did when he saw something he didn't trust, and I followed where he was looking, down into a tangle of driftwood and brush the flood had piled up against the bank. There was a boy in it. A Comanche boy. He'd been swept down in the flood, I figured out later, washed off some crossing miles upstream and carried down and jammed into that brush pile like a piece of driftwood himself. He was maybe 8 years old, maybe 9, smaller than me. He had a gash on his head that had bled down into his eye, and one of his legs was bent wrong, bent in a way a leg isn't supposed to bend, and his lips were blue, and for a long, terrible second I thought he was a dead thing. Then he moved, just barely. His chest hitched, and he made a sound that wasn't a word, just a thin, broken little sound, and his eyes came half open and looked at us. I have never in my life seen fear like what was in that child's face. He looked at us, two white people, the enemy, the people his whole world had taught him to dread, and he knew he was caught, and he was too hurt to even crawl, and that fear in his eyes was the fear of an animal in a trap that knows the hunter's coming. I looked at my uncle, and I want to tell you what I expected, because it tells you what kind of world it was. I expected Asa to back away, maybe to say a prayer over the boy and leave him to die, which is what mercy looked like to a lot of men out there. Or, and I'm ashamed to even put this into words, but it was in my head, I half expected him to do worse, because this was a Comanche child, and a Comanche child grew into a Comanche man, and Comanche men burned out families like ours. That's an ugly thing to admit a boy was thinking, but I was 12, and I'd been raised on fear, and fear makes ugly thoughts. Asa didn't do any of that. He stood there a long moment looking down at the boy, and I watched something move across my uncle's face. I didn't have words for it then, but I do now. It was the look of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like, adding up everything this could cost him, his wife, his daughters, me, the whole homestead, because there is one thing every person out there knew bone deep, and it was this: you do not touch a Comanche child. If a Comanche family thought you'd taken their child, harmed their child, even held their child, they would come for you, all of them, and there would be nothing left of you to bury. Asa knew that. He stood there and he knew exactly what he was looking at, which was a chance to die very badly. And then he handed me his rifle, and he climbed down into that brush pile, and he picked up that broken, freezing, terrified child as gentle as if it were one of his own girls. And he carried him up the bank. Asa, I said, my voice came out small. Asa, what are we? Hush, Eli, he said, that's my name, Eli. Just hush and walk. We carried him home. The boy passed out somewhere on the way, which was a mercy in itself, because that leg must have been pure agony. And the whole walk back, I kept looking over my shoulder at the ridgeline, at the empty plains, expecting them. Because if they'd seen us, if there was a Comanche out there on a horse watching us carry their child away, we were already dead and didn't know it yet. When we came through the door with him, Cora dropped the bowl she was holding. It shattered on the floor and nobody moved to clean it up. No, she said, just that. No, Asa, no. He's hurt, Asa said. He's a child and he's hurt. He's a Comanche child. Cora's voice was shaking. Do you know what they'll do? Do you know what happens to people who take their children? You've heard the same stories I have. You'll get us all killed. The girls, Asa, Eli. She was crying now, and she was angry, and she was terrified, all three at once. Put him back where you found him. And I want to be fair to my aunt, because she wasn't a cruel woman. She was a frightened mother, and everything she said was true. Everything. By every measure of sense and survival, she was right and Asa was wrong. Asa laid the boy down on the table, careful with that leg. He looked at his wife across the body of that child, and I'll never forget what he said, because it was the most words I ever heard him string together at once. Cora, he said, I have lived out here 11 years. I have done hard things, and I have looked away from hard things and told myself it was sense. I held a man's child once who was dying of the fever, and I couldn't do nothing for her but hold her, and I have thought about that little girl every day of my life since. Now, I do not know what comes of this. You might be right. This might be the end of all of us. But I am not going to stand in my own house and let a child die in the cold 20 feet from my door because I was afraid. I won't do it. I can't do it and still be a man. I'd want my daughters to know. He looked down at the boy. If they come for us, they come. But they'll find their child warm and fed and his legs set straight. That's the most I can give. And that's what I'm going to give. Cora stood there. The girls were peeking around the door of the back room, big-eyed and silent. And after a long, long time, my aunt wiped her face with the back of her hand and she said, "Then heat the water. If we're going to do a fool thing, we'll do it right." And she went and got her sewing things to close that gash on his head, because Cora Reardon was no coward, whatever her fear told her to say. That was the day everything turned. We just didn't know yet which way it was going to turn. We set his leg that first day. Asa had set legs on stock and on a man once, and he knew how, but it's a brutal thing to do, and the boy woke up in the middle of it. He screamed. Not words, just pain, raw, and then he tried to fight us, tried to crawl off the table, and it took all three of us to hold him while Asa got the splints tied. After, the boy lay there with tears running down into his hair, breathing hard, looking at the ceiling, and not one of us could meet his eyes. For 3 days I figured he'd die. The fever came that first night and it was a bad one. He shook and sweated and called out in his own language, words none of us understood, and once he reached up and grabbed Cora's wrist. She was wiping his face with a wet cloth and held on so tight he left marks, and said something over and over, the same word, and Cora just held still and let him hold her and said, I know, baby, I know," even though she didn't know any such thing. I think that was the night she stopped being afraid of him and started being a mother to him. She never said so, but you could see it. The fever broke on the 4th day. I was sitting with him. That had become my job, sitting with him, because the girls were too little and Asa and Cora had the whole place to keep running, and I saw his eyes change. They came clear. He looked at me, and there wasn't that animal in a trap fear anymore, just a long, careful watching, like he was trying to figure out what kind of thing I was. I didn't know what to say to him, so I said the only thing I could think of. I picked up the cup of broth Cora had left and I held it out and I said, "You hungry?" He didn't understand the words, but he understood the cup, and after a while he took it, drank the whole thing, watched me the entire time. That's how it started between us, a cup of broth. Over the next 2 weeks, and it was 2 weeks before that leg would bear any weight at all, that boy and I built up something I still don't have a good word for. It wasn't quite friendship because we couldn't talk, and there was always this wall between us made out of everything our two peoples had done to each other. But it was something. I'd point at things and say the word water, bread, horse, sun, and he'd say it back, careful, getting his mouth around the strange shapes. And then he'd say his word for it, and I'd try, and I was terrible at it, and one time I made such a mess of a word that he laughed. Actually laughed. A real laugh, a kid's laugh. We never did learn his name in his own tongue, or if he told us, we couldn't hold onto the shape of it. Cora started calling him Sparrow because he was small and quiet, and he'd cock his head sideways when he was listening hard, just like a little bird. He answered to it after a while. Sparrow. But here's the thing I need you to understand. The whole time, the whole 2 weeks, that fear never left. Not for 1 hour. Asa stopped sleeping right. He'd be up at all hours walking the perimeter. Every time a rider came through, his hand went to his rifle before he even saw who it was. Because every single day that boy was alive and getting stronger was another day his people might come. And the longer it went, the worse it got, because now we'd had him 2 weeks, healed him, and to a Comanche family looking for a lost child, that might look like exactly the crime they punished hardest. Taking, keeping. A neighbor of ours, an old buffalo hunter named Doyle Tanner who lived 8 miles east, rode through about the 12-day mark. He saw the boy through the open door before we could stop him, and his face went the color of ash. He pulled Asa outside. I followed, because nobody pays attention to a 12-year-old, and I heard the whole thing. "Are you out of your mind?" Tanner kept his voice low, but it was shaking. "Asa, that's a Comanche kid. Where'd you get him?" Asa told him. "The flood, the brush pile, the leg." Tanner closed his eyes. "You should have left him," he said. "God forgive me, I know how that sounds, but you should have left him." Or he stopped. He couldn't finish it. Even Doyle Tanner, who'd done hard things in his life, couldn't say the rest out loud. "They will come for him," he said instead. "You know they will. And when they do, they ain't going to stop to ask how it happened. They'll see white people holding a Comanche child and they will burn this place to the ground with all of you in it. Your girls, Asa, your girls. Then what would you have me do? Asa said, quiet, not angry, just tired. Tell me, Doyle, what's the move that keeps everybody safe? Because I've turned it over 100 ways and I can't find it. If I'd left him, he'd be dead and they might have found him dead and come anyway. If I take him out now and set him loose, he can't walk, he'll die in a day. There's no clean way through this. There never was. The only thing I get to choose is whether the boy lives or dies, and I chose lives. That's the only part of this that was ever mine to decide. Tanner didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. He rode off shaking his head, and I think he rode off believing he'd never see any of us alive again. 2 days later it came. It was a Sunday morning. I remember because Cora had the girls in their clean dresses and was reading to them out of the Bible, the way she did on Sundays since we were too far from any church to get to one. The morning was still and bright. Sparrow was sitting up on his pallet by then, his legs straight out in front of him, and I'd been teaching him a game with some pebbles, and he was beating me at it and grinning about it. And then the dogs started. We had 2 dogs, and they set up a howling fit, both of them facing west, hackles up. Asa was out at the corral. I heard him say one word, sharp, Cora. And something in his voice made my whole body go cold before I even knew why. I ran to the door. There was dust on the western ridge, a lot of dust. And then, out of the dust, they came over the rise and they kept coming and they kept coming, and my heart climbed up into my throat and stayed there. Riders, Comanche riders. I tried to count them and lost the count and started again. It was something near 60. 60 warriors, mounted, painted, coming down off that ridge toward our little homestead in a long line, unhurried, certain, the way you come when nothing on earth can stop you and you know it. I've never been so afraid in my life. Not before and not since. Cora had the girls behind her in a half-second, pushed back into the cabin. Asa came across the yard fast and grabbed his rifle from where it leaned by the door, and then he stopped. He stood there with that rifle in his hands and he looked at the 60 riders coming down the slope, and any man who's ever held a gun knows what he was figuring. 1 rifle, 60 warriors. He could maybe kill 2 or 3 before they killed all of us. The math was simple, and it was hopeless. And I watched my uncle make the second hard choice of that whole story. The first one was picking the boy up out of the flood. The second one was this. He set the rifle down. He leaned it against the wall of the cabin, real careful, and he stepped away from it, out into the middle of the yard, with his hands open and empty at his sides. Cora made a sound behind me, a sound I can't describe. Asa didn't look back at her. He just stood there in the open with nothing in his hands, in front of 60 mounted warriors, the most defenseless a man can possibly be. Asa, Cora whispered, Asa, please. It's the only thing left that might work, he said, not turning around. A man with a gun they kill. A man with empty hands maybe they listen long enough to see. He took a breath. Eli, get the boy, bring him to the door, slow, let them see him. My legs didn't want to work, but I made them. I went to Sparrow and his face had gone strange. He was up on his knees now, staring out the door at the riders, and he was making a sound. A high, excited, urgent sound, and he was trying to get up on that bad leg and falling and trying again. I got my arm under him. He was light as anything, and I helped him to the doorway into the light where 60 pairs of eyes could see him. The whole line of riders stopped. All at once, like one creature, 60 horses stopped dead maybe 100 yards out. The dust they'd raised kept drifting forward past them, thinning out in the still air. And in the middle of that line, one man pushed his horse forward ahead of the rest. A big man, older than Asa. He had a way of sitting a horse that made you understand without anybody telling you that this was the one they all answered to. And he was staring at the doorway, at Sparrow. The boy in my arms screamed something. One word, over and over, the same word he'd cried out in his fever, and now I understood it, because the man on the horse went rigid like he'd been struck, and then that big hard man made a sound that I have only ever heard come out of a father. The word Sparrow was screaming was the word for his father. He'd been calling for him the whole time. In the fever, in the dark, in the pain. And now his father was 100 yards away on a horse, and the two of them had found each other across all that distance and all that fear. What happened next I'll tell you in a minute, but I have to stop here and tell you what was true in that moment, because it changes everything that came after. Those 60 warriors had not come to ask politely. They had come because a war chief's son had vanished in a flood, and they had tracked him, and the trail of that boy had led them, over days, over miles, straight to a white family's cabin. They had come to a place that was holding their chief's lost child. And there is only one reason 60 armed Comanche ride to a place like that. They had come to kill us all and take the body home. That's the truth of where we stood. Asa empty-handed in the yard, Sparrow in the doorway in my arms, and 60 warriors who had ridden a long, hard way to do murder. For a moment, nothing moved. The chief sat his horse 100 yards out and stared at his son in the doorway, and his son cried for him. And the distance between them was full of everything. All the fear, all the history, all the blood that white people in Comanche had spilled on each other for 40 years. And I stood there holding that boy up, and I felt his whole little body straining toward his father, and I made the only decision a 12-year-old could make, which was no real decision at all. I helped him forward. Out the door, into the yard beside my uncle. Sparrow couldn't walk on that leg, so he did the only thing he could. He went down on his hands and his good knee in the dirt of our yard, and he started to crawl toward his father, dragging that splinted leg, crying, reaching out. And his father came off that horse. He didn't ride forward. He got down and he ran. A big man, a war chief. 60 warriors at his back, and he ran across the open ground on his own 2 feet toward his crawling child. And he dropped down in the dirt and gathered that boy up in his arms, and he held him, and he rocked him, and he made sounds that no language needs translating. I have seen grown men cry maybe 4 or 5 times in my whole life. That was one of them, and it was the hardest of all of them, because it came out of a man who you could see had spent his whole life never letting anyone watch him do it. He held his son and he ran his hands over him, the boy's face, the gash that Cora had sewn closed and that was healing clean, the splinted leg, the warm-fed body of him. And I watched the chief understand, piece by piece, what he was looking at. This was not a child who'd been taken. This was a child who'd been mended. Somebody had set his leg straight. Somebody had closed the wound on his head with small, careful stitches. Somebody had fed him until the bones didn't show. Somebody had kept him warm and kept him alive and was now standing in the yard with empty hands and no weapon, just giving him back. The chief looked up, at Asa, and for a long, long moment those 2 men just looked at each other across the body of that child. Then the chief said something to Sparrow, a question, and the boy answered and I watched him point. He pointed at Asa. He pointed at the cabin where Cora stood in the doorway with the girls clutched to her skirts, and he pointed at me. He pointed at me and he said something, and whatever it was, it made his father look at me hard, and then it made his father do a thing I didn't expect at all. He put his hand flat on his own chest, and he dipped his head, to me. A 12-year-old white boy, he bowed his head to me. I didn't know what to do, so I did the same back. Hand on my chest, head down. It was probably all wrong, I probably did it like a fool, but it was the only respect I knew how to give. The chief stood up with his son in his arms, and he walked toward Asa, and behind him, those 60 warriors had come down off the ridge by now and spread out around the edges of our yard. And every one of them was watching, and not one of them moved, because their chief was walking forward with his hands full of his living child, and that was all the order anybody needed. He stood in front of Asa. The 2 men were nearly of a height, and the chief reached out slow and he took Asa's empty right hand, the hand that had picked the boy out of the flood and set his leg, and he gripped it hard in both of his. And he spoke, a long stream of words none of us understood. But you didn't need the words. You had the eyes and you had the grip and you had the child held safe against his chest. Then he let go. He went back to his horse, swung up with his son in front of him, and he gave a command, and the whole war party began to turn and ride back the way they'd come. But before he went, he sent one rider forward, an older man who came right up to the edge of the porch and looked down at Asa, and this one spoke a little English. Not much, broken, but enough. "My chief say," the man told us slow, finding each word, "this place, this family." He gestured wide all around the cabin, the corral, all of it. "Under his hand now, no Comanche touch, no Comanche take, you ride you safe, they see this mark." And he showed Asa something, I couldn't see it well, some token. The chief had pressed it into Asa's hand when they shook. "You safe," the man said again. "All your days, the chief does not forget the one who carried his son out of the water." And then he wheeled his horse and was gone after the rest. And in a few minutes the dust had settled back down on the western ridge, and the morning was still and bright again. And you'd never have known that 60 warriors had been sitting in our yard at all, except that all 5 of us were standing there shaking like leaves. Cora got to Asaph first. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, and the girls latched onto both of their legs, and I stood a little apart from it the way orphans do. And then Asa reached out one arm and pulled me in two, into the middle of all of them, and that's where I stayed. I want to tell you what came after, because the story doesn't end in that yard. It was true what the writer said, every word of it. Over the next 4 years, until everything changed for the Comanche, and that's a sad story for another day, there were raids all through that country. Hard ones. Families burned out east of us, north of us, families we knew. Doyle Tanner, the old buffalo hunter, lost his stock and his cabin both in the spring of '73 and came to us with nothing but the clothes on his back, and we took him in and he stayed. But nobody ever touched us. Not once. Not a horse, not a calf, not a fence rail. We'd ride into town past sign of a war party not 2 miles off and ride home untouched. Once I saw this with my own eyes. A small bunch of young warriors came down off the ridge toward our corral one evening, and Asa stepped out into the yard, and one of the older ones with them said something sharp and pointed, and they turned right around and rode off. They knew the place. They knew the mark. We were under his hand, just like the man said, and a Comanche chief's word was worth more than any fence or rifle ever was. We saw Sparrow one more time. It was about 2 years on. A small party came in slow, in daylight, no paint, and the chief was with them, and there was a tall straight-backed boy riding beside him who sat his horse like he'd never had a broken leg in his life. He'd grown. He looked at me across the yard, and there was a second where neither of us knew what to do, 2 boys from 2 worlds that were never supposed to be friends. And then he grinned, the same grin from the Pebble game, and I grinned back. And his father set down a gift on the ground at the edge of our yard, a fine buffalo robe, tanned soft, big enough to cover a bed, and they turned and rode away, and that was the last we ever saw of any of them. Cora kept that robe her whole life. It's mine now. I'm an old man and it's worn thin in places, but I won't part with it, and when I'm gone it'll go to my own grandchildren, and I'll have told them the story, and they'll know what it is. People ask me sometimes, the few I've ever told this to, whether my uncle knew, whether he picked that boy up out of the flood because he figured it might pay off someday. And I always tell them the same thing. No, Asa Reardon didn't know a thing. He couldn't have known. When he climbed down into that brush pile, every fact he had told him it was the end of him and everyone he loved. He did it anyway. He did it knowing it might cost him his whole world. And he did it for no reason except that there was a hurt child in front of him, and he was a man who couldn't walk past that. That's the part people get wrong about it, I think. They want it to be a story about how kindness gets rewarded, and I suppose it is a little. But that's not what it was while it was happening. While it was happening, it was just a man choosing to do the right thing into the teeth of every reason not to, with no promise of anything back but a quick death. The reward came. 60 warriors on the ridge, and they let us live, and they kept us safe for years. But the mercy came first, and the mercy came blind, and that's the only kind of mercy that ever really counts for anything. My uncle has been gone a long time now. He died old in his bed with Cora holding his hand, which is a finer death than most men got out there. And every year of his life after that morning, he lived it as a free gift. All of us did, on land that should have been ashes. Because once, when it could have cost him everything, he reached down into the cold water and chose not to look away. You can spend your whole life out here learning that the world is hard, and that the only thing that keeps you alive is being harder. And then one gray morning, the whole truth of it turns over in your hands, and you find out that the bravest thing a man can do, the thing that saves him and everybody he loves, is to set his rifle down, open his empty hands, and be gentle when there's every reason on God's earth not to be. That's the story. That's the whole of it, just the way it happened. Mercy don't come back the way you give it. Sometimes it comes back over a ridge with 60 horses behind it, and instead of taking everything you have, it leans down and it lets you live.